It's been a while since I've talked to my next guest rather. I look forward to it very much. He is, in my view, a very important thinker as we enter and continue to deal with the challenges of the new and rising technological age. Frank Pasquale is a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School. He is the author of the book, The Black Box Society, The Secret Algorithms That Control Money and Information. We talked about that back in 2015, very important book. His new book is entitled New Laws of Robotics, Defending Human Expertise in the Age of AI. So without any further ado, Frank Pasquale, thanks for coming back on the program.
Oh, thank you, Richard. It's great to be back. I really enjoyed a chance to talk with you back about Black Box Society. And now this book, I think, is a nice compliment to it. So thanks.
Oh, absolutely. And I've got it on Kindle here. So, well, I shouldn't do a brand plug. I've got it on a tablet of undetermined origin here. And I was a science fiction nerd growing up. I was an Isaac Asimov devotee. And I even wrote him a letter when I was 12.
Wow.
A nice little handwritten card back. So every kid like that will remember the original 3 laws of robotics, which, as you remind me, were originally included in a 1942 story, Asimov being a scientist as well as science fiction writer. Now, those laws, well, it's interesting, we could talk about them, but those laws were based on the idea, I would say, of robots as independent, humanoid, conscious creations. And when seen in that light, actually, as I read them again in your book, they seemed a little brutal, actually, because if you accept the premise that Asimov's robots were conscious, then, it was a terrible form of slavery imposed by those 3 laws, right? Must always serve a human, must always sacrifice a life to a human. Well, let's get the 3 ones right before you may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm, must obey the orders given it by human beings, except when such orders would conflict with the first law, must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. I mean, it's a terrible kind of slavery there, but understandable given the state of the discourse in 1942, I guess. Now you have New Laws of Robotics. That's the premise of your book, and maybe we can start there. If I recall correctly, you have 3 as well, maybe 4, but you have some fundamental, simple principles. But before we even get to them, Frank Pasquale, let's talk about what robotics or AI even is, because I think it's one of those, both terms have a nebulosity that, different people, it's like Rorschach, different people imagine different things when they think of those. So let's, first of all, kind of stipulate what robotics is, if you don't mind.
Sure, and I loved your Asimov story, and that's quite a nice story about getting a card back from this famous writer. And I think that in terms of defining robotics and AI, one of the clearest definitions for robotics would be that you've got a machine that has sensors that act like our senses: eyes, nose, ear, mouth, etc. It has an information processor that processes that information, that I think is a really good definition for AI. And then it has actuators like arms, legs, whatever we have on our body to do what it is meant to be done. And with respect to artificial intelligence, I mean, that's another fascinating term. I mean, whatever is going on in that information processor in the robot or in a bot or software online, essentially, I like to think of it as a way of mimicking the type of work that's now being done by humans or computers within another context. So the artificiality is all really coming down to a kind of simulation. It's simulating people, simulating what other machines do, et cetera, simulating animals sometimes too. There's biomimicry in AI as well. And that, I think, helps put us on a good level playing field in terms of thinking about, or on the knowing what we're addressing before getting into how to regulate it.
I appreciate that definition, Frank. It's very clear. And I also appreciate the framing of AI, because one of my I used to work in the tech world and all that. I've always considered AI programming. This notion, this implicit notion that some people have that it might carry a form of consciousness or sentience is, to me, a long way from, if ever, from coming to fruition. I think, people use it almost to fetishize a program that can perform certain functions, maybe an enormously sophisticated program, maybe a heuristic program that can learn as it goes. But to me, it's important to understand that we're not talking about, at least in my view, unless you may disagree, about super beings who are going to, turn against us, build Skynet, and do all those things. At this point in history, to me, that's inconceivable. We're talking about technologies that could conceivably, will dramatically influence human beings, their relationships to each other, economy, planet, etc. Is that fair from your point of view?
It is true, yes. And I think that there's a lot of excitement and fear built up around like the robot takeover. Could that happen at some point in the future? And I think and I actually do think that it's worth thinking about in things like science fiction, scenario analysis, etc. But what we're dealing with right now are things like a hiring robot, right? I mean, people are hiring AI, where people are being subjected, their interviews are being analyzed by an AI that's saying, oh, your face looks like the face of someone that fits in with our company, or your voice actually wouldn't fit in with our company, or something like that. And I think that's where, these sorts of very day-to-day things, or like a security guard robot that some firms are putting out there now that, can watch what's going on and roll up to someone and videotape them and report them to the police or something like that. These are the very basic types of robots that are happening now. And, I mean, part of what my book is arguing for is like, keep them at a relatively simple level, or at least in many ways, in many areas, you want to keep them helping human professionals, human workers, as opposed to replacing them, so that we can maintain some level of human control.
And that, to me, obviously, that's the theme of your book. It's a human-centered or humanistic view of the technology. You approach multiple dimensions of that, but maybe the easiest place to start is with labor, the impact on labor. And we both know the word robot itself comes from an early 20th century play, a Czech play, and the word robotnik, which means worker, right? So from the beginning, robots were conceived as working machines that do work, which immediately poses a psychological and potentially economic threat to the workforce. And we know about automation in the workforce. So how does that intersect with your laws of robotics?
That was really the inspiration for the book. Is about 10 years ago, there was a real panic, I think, among a lot of journalists who were saying, watch out, the pharmacist jobs, lawyer jobs, doctor jobs. We've all, over the decades, we've seen manufacturing jobs go to robotics. And it makes a lot of sense, because a lot of the work that is done, and certainly not all of it, but a lot of it is being done at an assembly line. It's routine. It can be sort of programmed into a machine. But what was the big promise about 10 years ago was that you'd see lots of other people subject to these types of pressures. And, one of the things that's remarkable about those predictions is how few of them have come true. Of course, in an age of COVID, there's a lot of pressure for various places to automate based economically, or because they just want to keep people social distancing. But by and large, most of these jobs aren't automated. And even with respect to self-driving cars, we're so far behind, in terms of where we thought we'd be. And so part of what the book is arguing is that I go through why that's the case. Why is it so hard to make a robot doctor or a robot lawyer or even a robot journalist? And then I get into
why even a robot journalist. I'll try not to take offense at that, but please continue.
No, it's funny too, because and people could say, and this is where it raises some really interesting questions about like how people think of their own jobs.
Right. Of course.
If people just think, well, all that I'm doing is asking questions, and then you could sort of like use a natural language program to generate questions out of, the text of the book or out of other appearances that I've made in the past. Sure, but like much is lost, right? I mean, much is lost in terms of personal experience, in terms of sort of some level of connection, in terms of some level of understanding what's going on. And I think that's one of the things, one of the gifts of the pandemic in a way has been, I mean, I certainly don't want to say it's all a good thing, but I'm just saying that like we have learned so much about how important like human interaction is in so many fields. And I think that's been a really, and that's an underlying theme of the book, especially when I talk about robots and AI in health and education.
I think that's a terrific point, and I think that I also think that we've learned something about the pain of automation, not just from the jobs lost to it, but for example, globalization. The jobs lost to globalization are for the person losing the job, I would think indistinguishable. You're subject to historical forces, shifts that have not been, in my view, sufficiently addressed by your society. So you're on losing it. And I think that, but one of the great points that you make in your book, the New Laws of Robotics, is, I would put it this way. You don't put it, I don't think you express it this way, but I would express it as, the scares particularly, as well as the enthusiasm about replacing humans with machines, whether it's AI or a robotic device of some kind, is the failure to include the qualitative as well as the quantitative role of the job. Whether it's, you certainly described this very well with teachers, with doctors and other healthcare professionals and so on, that a teacher is more than just a transmitter of flat information. Yeats said education is the lighting of a fire, not the filling of a pail, or the like downloading of a spreadsheet, and to modernize it, and the human sensitivities and interactions in the healthcare profession and so on. So basically, I don't want to like steal your punchline, but what my takeaway from the employment dimension of the book has been that a well-designed approach to technology in the workforce is one of augmentation of humans rather than the replacing of humans. I'm not sure I'm expressing it well, but that's or interpreting it accurately, but that's my sense of what you've concluded. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of thinking about the qualitative and the quantitative, because I think that there's a real emphasis on when those who want to automate a job or robotize it come in, they often want to say, well, what are the metrics for the current job and how will we use a machine to make those metrics? So for example, with school, you can imagine someone coming in with a cheap robot teacher or some combination of online resources and saying, well, as long as we can get the kids to a certain score on their No Child Left Behind tests or whatever the test might be at the end of the year, then let's do it any way possible. And I think that one of the things that increasingly people are going to need to say to their bosses and to the larger society is actually what we're doing here is it constitutes teaching. It's not like, oh, you could just do it in any particular way. You actually do need to have a person in front of the kids, sort of modeling certain behavior for them, showing certain forms of care and respect, and also democratizing what we even teach. Right? Because one of the things that I found just interesting is just the randomness of, some teachers will really focus on, for example, if they're teaching English literature, Shakespeare. Other teachers are going to focus on, Wordsworth or, whoever might be and now we've got lots of very important debates about expanding the canon, and as that happens, that's something that really, it depends on the passion and the interest and the viewpoint of a person and their history. It's not something that you could really code a machine to do any of that. Yeah.
Right. I think that's very well said. And I guess this is as good a place to start on this dimension of your argument in New Laws of Robotics as well, too. What I struggle with this and in other areas is how one takes that kind of thinking, your kind of thinking, for which I accept and agree with, and turn it into social behavior, political initiatives, law, precedent. I mean, business practice. I mean, there are a million ways that those sorts of insights can be translated into the human sphere as spheres of activity. And I wonder whether we're talking about this or some of the other laws of robotics, how one goes about implementing them, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and I think that this is an area where we have to push ahead on all sorts of fronts. And so, in the book itself, I do have some ideas about how you change, say, the reimbursement for medical care so that you don't encourage, say, insurers to push people onto automated chatbot therapy. You make it so that they can actually afford, you make it so they can actually afford human-to-human contact in therapeutic encounters. That's one of them. Another would be, for example, when we're thinking about journalism, some of the stuff that Australia, Europe, other jurisdictions are doing to try to give a fairer share to journalists. I think that's key, because what I see now, especially in the knowledge sphere, journalism, media, lots of other areas, is these very large intermediaries sucking up all of the oxygen, in a way, taking all the profits, and then not having very much left for actual people doing the jobs of journalism and other areas like that. And I also, what I didn't put in the book, but what I've been writing in my law review articles, is how you adjust things like tort law. So, for example, I've just come out with an article, about like, if there's a robot surgeon makes a mistake, holding it accountable is really important. And right now, the people behind robotic surgeons and robotic medical devices, they're really good at deflecting liability, right? So we have to, it's also a battle in the courts in terms of saying, hey, we've got to make sure that the laws are, when a robot takes on a human role, substitutes for a human, they have the full brunt of the liability there. I could say the same about robot lawyers as well. There's been a big battle between the federal regulators and state regulators about like robot will writers and other things like that, or AIs. Right. Like that. And right now, so often, what the law does is the opposite. It tilts things in favor of the big tech firm, like letting Amazon not be taxed for so many years, right? Finally, in 2018, they get taxed, and then but by that time it's too late. I mean, they've destroyed much of so much of Main Street retail, and so that, I think, is got to be part of the story, is like a level playing field, or even a playing field that is like biased in favor of human labor, rather than one that now is so much in favor of like technology and capital.
Frank Pasquale, this notion of legal responsibility and accountability, to me, this is another area where I feel sometimes as if the glamour or the gloss or the seemingly exotic nature of the technology distracts people from what, to me, maybe I'm a simplistic thinker, is a very simple chain of responsibility. If I fix your brakes, which I don't know how to do, so I don't recommend it, but if I fix your brakes, if I take on that responsibility and I do a bad job and they fail and they kill a pedestrian, there's a pretty clear precedent for what my liability is. Why should it be any different if I create a robot surgeon program that failed to adequately consider all the possibilities that might arise during this procedure? Why am I any less liable because of the quote unquote magic of an electronic switch versus the unmagic of a brake disc? I mean, I don't get it. I just think that either I'm missing something important, or we're just over exoticizing what to me is a fairly simple chain of liability. But you're the law professor, so what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, and it is a situation where a lot of doctrines come together to help technologists, in terms of, like, for example, there's a doctrine in medicine called, the theory of a competent human intervention. So even if the software or the AI, the software that's advising a doctor or AI that they're using, something goes wrong, a lot of times what ends up happening is the courts say, well, but there was a doctor there and the doctor has to bear full responsibility.
Right.
And that's a common theme in tort law. I mean, for example, even with autopilot cases, there were all these cases of planes crashing in the 50s because their autopilot didn't work. And then the question became, well, we're going to actually blame the pilot, not the autopilot, in terms of like whom to blame. And this Madeline Ellis is this researcher who calls this the moral crumple zone. It's like the person who's supposed to be persons in there who gets to take the responsibility. And so I think that's a problem. And I think that part of what and also there's contract, right? Some of these entities, they say, well, if you're going to use our software, you've got to just sign this contract that promises that not only that you won't sue us, but you'll indemnify us if anybody else sues over what happens with the software. So, that again is a way in which if the powerful entity can really use the law to deflect responsibility. And part of, I think, yeah.
That's interesting because you have the self-driving car tests also where there's a human employee who just sits there while the car reportedly drives itself, and the human employee, at least in the tests, is considered the sort of locus of liability. It's almost like they're legal cannon fodder. They're not actually operating the vehicle. They have the same job as a driver of a vehicle, but more boring and more inclined to lead to inattention, so that if there is a problem, they're going to be, as I think we've seen in cases, not paying attention. There'll be a fatality. So they're basically just like, I don't know, cows strapped to the front of the train who have to get hurt. If it is, it's a fascinating, to me, it's a perfect, that example of a self-driving car or the pilot that has to pay attention to the autopilot is a perfect example of, well, why do we exactly have the technology then? Unless it's to make sure that cannon fodder doesn't need to be as well trained, in which case why should they have the legal responsibility? So it seems to me we're just creating gray areas where responsibility falls in the middle through the cracks.
It's a big worry. And I think that, one of the other things that's going to be a big challenge over the next 10, 20 years in this space is how we arrange both an AI, like if the AI or robotics is the front line driver, caregiver, or whatever it might be, and then you have a person watching it, and then is there going to be a secondary set of eyes that's watching the person watching the AI?
Right.
And that to me is like worrisome, because I think that like there has to be a better way to arrange these types of relationships. And I think to me, the better way involves always having the person sort of being the front line, or not in every single case, but more often than is currently imagined, you have the person being the front line. Just to give an example of that, there are these cases involving nursing homes where you have management companies come in and say, well, let's have the surveillance of everything that goes on 24/7. And that'll help ensure that all the workers in the nursing home are taking care of the elderly, not neglecting them. But then the unions come back and say, well, wait a second, that's a really inhumane workplace if you're going to record what I'm doing 24/7, right? It's like we've all been sort of had this Zoom experience of like even just having all our meetings recorded is a bit of a burden, but imagine everything, watching you everywhere. And so then the question becomes, what's a humane compromise, where we both take advantage of the new technology that can spot problems, but we don't make it oppressive. And I think another example, I mean, in a lower stakes context, is this Marty the robot that's been in some grocery stores. It's a really bizarre looking robot, just has this very tall, has this sort of weird face with Google eyes. And it goes around, and its purpose is supposedly to find spills. And so, but then it finds a spill and then it just starts beeping loudly at workers.
That sounds annoying.
Yeah. And it's like, and that's where like automation of the boss, I mean, we don't necessarily need to have more automated bosses and surveillance systems and people that can mark us down. It's let's try to find automation that can actually get the work done,
Right. I have immediately reverted to visions of vandalism that I won't share because I don't want to be a suspect should Marty be assassinated at some point. But that's fascinating. There's so many topics covered in your book, Frank Pasquale, that I want to be sure we get to, though, you've mentioned it already, is journalism and information. Because this to me is, we've created a new system, like an information ecosystem, that it's the closest we've got to that Skynet scenario, in the sense that, at least that I just dismissed, in the sense that it has its own feedback loops, it has its own reward systems, which of course are the reward systems designed by the people making billions of dollars from it. But nevertheless, it is in fact a kind of entity that exists and thrives on clicks, which in turn are driven by inflammatory stories, antagonism, rage, and because all the data scientists I've talked to who study this know that that's what creates the responses. So it's almost a giant monster that feeds on human anger in a sense, and yet. For all of that, and you certainly address it in New Laws of Robotics, I do fear enormously the idea of human elites deciding to reprogram this monster according to what they deem to be legitimate and truthful information. Because I think at that point, we've reached a frightening level of kind of potential dystopia, even if they're well-intentioned people that, they don't believe that it was Hunter Biden's laptop that was in that store, or they don't, whatever it is, you cite the false stories against Hillary Clinton. It may begin with the best of intentions, but ultimately my fear is that the machine, instead of becoming a rage machine, becomes a kind of truth control machine. Do you get what my concern is? Or
yeah, and I think that part of my book is really the one that I take a pretty European approach to the public sphere, and I think that in the U.S. I think that your intuitions are certainly shared by the current U.S. Supreme Court and by most of the First Amendment bar, which would say, okay, we acknowledge that a lot of things are going wrong in the contemporary digital public sphere, that there's a lot of conspiracy theories, false information about vaccines and about anti-vax stuff, and raising unfounded concerns about vaccines, other sorts of things like that. But the fundamental principle of the U.S. approach is that we think that overall the First Amendment dictates that that the first and most troubling problem would be having state control of the media, right? And I think the opposite approach would be China, right? China's approach would be to say, actually, in order to promote social harmony, we need to make sure that there's a Ministry of Propaganda that can actually take control and can make sure that we are using the AI in that system, not for profit to some extent, but also very strongly to knit social cohesion and to have a sort of strong common purpose as a nation, that can be built around very positive and negative things, right? It can be built around, let's get rid of carbon by 2025 or 2030, in terms of like a Green New Deal or a green vision for China that Xi is putting forward. And it can be built around, let's completely ignore the atrocities in Xinjiang or even inculcate them and think of them as a good thing. And so I think that the reason why I come to this sort of European position, and I wish I'd sort of framed it this way in the book, but it's only been in later dialogues that I've thought about this way, is that I tend to think that there's something between the US sort of Wild West First Amendment approach and the Chinese sort of top-down, more dirigiste authoritarian approach. And I think that something is being worked out in Europe. I mean, I think that they are trying to work out ways of both having a robust public sphere, but stopping, say, the worst hate speech and the worst forms of demonization of, say, refugees, immigrants, migrants, the Muslim population, et cetera. And I want to study this more, in terms of like how those compromises are being made. Certainly some of them are going to be negative, but I do want to recognize them as like one potential way through the middle, where we don't necessarily have to go full tilt toward a free expression fundamentalism, and we don't need to go full tilt toward like an authoritarian top-down approach. But you're right to say that it's a difficult issue. Whenever these things come up, they're very difficult. Yeah.
And I would only add to that, Frank, that to me, the quote unquote free market system that we adhere to in our law and our political philosophy, in this case, is turning out to be as totalitarian as the Chinese style state control we fear as a culture, because, whether it's the 10-man committee at the top ranks of the Chinese government, or the 4-person committee of Google, Facebook, Twitter, CEO, well, that's only 3, but CEOs, neither is democratic, right? Neither is free, neither permits open discourse. So, yeah, to me, where I've come to is the only way to restrain this machine is by breaking it up. I'm not sure how that looks yet, but some form of democratic control. That's 2014, I proposed that tech companies be regulated as public utilities. I'm not sure that's still my answer, but to me, there's just too much power in too few hands. And maybe that leads us to what I think was your final point of the laws of robotics. You describe it as your final point: a political judgment, our institutions of governance are actually capable of achieving exactly that outcome, meaning the right balance of human and machine. I really appreciate the trust in our institutions of human governance, and I think wherever they've fallen short, it's incumbent on us to make them better, not lose trust in them. But do you want to talk about that for a minute, about how you could conceive of this working? Is it a matter of laws like the Europeans are passing? Is it a matter of commissions and investigations first to bring public opinion along? Is it, because of course my fear is our institutions of governance may work, but 35% of the population may think we're now living under fascism and rebel violently. So on the right is what I'm describing here. So any thoughts about how that might play out in the real world?
It's something that's going to happen on many different levels, right? In terms of like how current law and governance actually deals with these things. It's funny. I have worked as like an advisor for Federal Advisory Committee, or working on a Federal Advisory Committee at Health and Human Services that looks at some of these questions like AI and robotics. And so that's how it's going to filter through. Sometimes it's going to be, just experts advising some of the people working deep in HHS and these other agencies. Sometimes it's going to be legislation. There's some really interesting legislation on the front burner now in many jurisdictions that's about stopping facial recognition, saying we just don't trust the police to have the ability to identify anybody by face, that's just too restrictive and too infringing on people's freedom. And so I think that there's going to be a number of levels here, and that, we can do this, but part of it also is going to rely on more funding. And I say that in this book, I said in my last book, you need to actually make sure that the people that are behind these actions are well funded, and that they actually have and that the right people are doing them, and that they have a somewhat, and I mean, that's where, certainly if you have a Trump in charge, nothing gets done. Nothing very good is going to get done in those 4 years. I mean, maybe there were a few things, but almost nothing. But if you have the right personnel, the current institutions really can carry the ball forward to put all of the principles that I've talked about in action. And in various ways, they already are in action. In very different regulatory agencies, regulation of financial technology, other healthcare is certainly one of the most regulated areas out there, and education as well. So I think that, it's part of it is when we see government failing, the one reaction can be, let's get rid of government, right? But another reaction can be, hey, what have we done over the past 50, 60 years to like defund the government and to reduce its power and influence? And how can we try to actually staff it with people that love the job, that like are being fairly compensated, and that, have some level of energy? So that I think
we've also defunded the government of goodwill and trust, right? We've created a kind of cultural deficit. And I think for a while we invested that in the tech industry. And I think public sentiment has come to realize that may not have been the way to go. And so I think that the initiatives you're describing, I certainly hope we see them come to fruition. I think they'll have public support. I think people have come to understand that they can't trust tech lords or whatever you want to call them to do this for them, that this will have to be a democratic initiative. So I strongly, unfortunately, I guess we'll have to conclude, but I strongly encourage people to read your book, which again, I'm all of a sudden embarrassingly not finding the title, New Laws of Robotics, Defending Human Expertise in the Age of AI. I strongly encourage people to read it. And Frank Pasquale, as always, great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's been really a great conversation. So thanks again.
Absolutely. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.